Welcome everybody to another video. In this video we're going to be translating Philippians 2 verses 17 through 18. And of course this class is offered courtesy of Maranatha Baptist University and Seminary. And this is part of the class Exegetical Method. Well, here is what the verses look like. We notice that it starts with Allah there, and in just a minute we're going to talk about probably the best way to translate that in light of the context. Allah usually is contrastive, usually it can be translated but not always. And this is an interesting word here. Spendomai is the word that means to be poured out as a drink offering. It's used quite a few times in the Septuagint. For instance, when David, actually, when he was in a battle, he was so thirsty, he asked the three of his best soldiers to go get him a drink and bring it back to him. So they broke through the enemy lines, they brought him a drink. And David realized, well, how can I drink this when all the other soldiers are just as thirsty as I am? And it says he poured it out as an offering. This is the word that's used, and it's used a number of other times to talk about pouring out an offering to the Lord. And so that's an interesting word there. The Apostle Paul also uses this word in 2 Timothy when he talks about being ready to be offered because the time of his departure, his death, was at hand. So those are all helpful references which will help us appreciate the meaning of that word. Thusia is a word for sacrifice. Liturgia is the word for a priestly kind of service. It's done in worship to the Lord. And then we also see in these two verses, we see the kairo and the sun kairo. It seems a little redundant, just translating them. We've got rejoice and rejoice with. And the same thing happens down here. We've got rejoice, or you all rejoice, and rejoice with. And so we'll talk about that as well and what might be the best way to translate that in English. But before we do want to consider a couple of things from the context. And the first thing would be, verses 17 and 18, they're following what seems to be the force of an imperative. You look at chapter 2, verse 14. I'm looking at the Greek text here. And there's the verb poiete, which is an imperative. Do all things without grumbling and complaining. And then verses 15 and 16 follow the heels of that imperative, in order that you might be blameless and harmless. In verse 16, it says, holding forth the word of life. These follow that imperative, poiete, in verse 14. And so if verses 17 and 18 are kind of following or piggybacking on the force of that imperative, they would seem to suggest the possibility that Paul will rejoice, because in these verses we're going to translate in just a minute, he's going to say, I rejoice and rejoice with all of you. But is the idea that he will if they obey these imperatives? And so that's an important question, because that will help influence how we need to translate Allah. But I'm going to say here probably not, because Allah is emphatic, and it also has a contrastive force about it. Sometimes when there's a slightly different emphasis now, or a contrast, the Allah will be used to signify that. And it seems to be establishing in these two verses a kind of in any case scenario. In other words, the Apostle Paul had already established that he believes the Philippians are going to end well, because the one who's working in them to do of his good pleasure, he'll finish it to the day of Jesus Christ. He makes that pretty clear. And then based on the Philippians' spiritual progress already, well, Paul had every reason to be thinking this way. So we're going to translate it as a kind of in any case scenario. Paul is going to rejoice if he's poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of these Philippians' faith. And so hopefully this issue makes sense to you. And if you have any questions about this, or it wasn't completely clear, we can talk about it either through an email or through a Skype call or something like that. So here's the two verses, and let's go ahead and translate these. Starting with Allah, of course, in its contracted form there. And here we're going to translate it even, because it seems to have an emphatic force. And so we've got the kai here, and let's translate, and even I would be if, and then spendomai is if I am offered The idea is as a drink offering. Upon the sacrifice and service. So let's go ahead and write that out. And even if I am offered as a drink offering, upon the, write it down here, sacrifice and service, tes pisteos humon, that should be pretty easy to translate. Pisteos in the genitive form, so it's of your faith, the service of your faith. And then we've got kairo kai sum kairo. I rejoice, and literally rejoice with, we've got pasin humin, with all of you. Now, since I'm not a native Greek speaker, I don't know how kairo kai sum kairo would have sounded to the Philippians or to the listeners, anybody who listened to this letter being read. But I do know that in English, it sounds a little funny if we say, I rejoice and rejoice with all of you. It sounds redundant because when you say, I rejoice and rejoice, it's the same verb. Whereas technically in Greek, you've got kairo and sum kairo. It's kind of the same verb, but with the prefix there, it's a little different. And so one way I think that we can make this sound good in English, but also preserve the Greek sense here, is if we say, I rejoice and share my joy with all of you. And then we're going to go ahead and do the same thing when we get down here to the kairete and sunkairete. And so we also have to decide at the beginning of verse 18 how to translate ta de auto. So we've got this personal pronoun, right? Auto from autos, which can often mean, most often it means he or she or it, but that's not how it's being used here. It's either used for emphasis or for identity, which would be the same way or for the same reason. Of course, the article goes with it here. I'm going to go ahead and write down the two possibilities that I think we have. We could say and, translating de and in the same way. Or it could be and for the same reason. I don't think there's a huge difference between these two possibilities, but here we've got manner, and here we would have motive. So there is a little bit of a difference here, and maybe the Apostle Paul is touching on both of these. That certainly is possible. I think what he's talking about, though, is the fact that as an apostle, he was specifically and specially called to labor for the good of other people. And this is what he's describing here, that even if he gives his life for these Philippians, that'll be a joyful thing for him. And that's something that they can rejoice in too. And so I think probably I would choose, and for the same reason, that they could rejoice and rejoice with the Apostle Paul. But again, I don't think it's of great exegetical significance whether we choose one over the other. But I tend to favor this one here. And for the same reason, he says, I'll just go ahead and put do. And for the same reason, do you rejoice? And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing which I did up here. Do you rejoice and share your joy with me. And as I'm always saying in our class, of course, there will be some variation between our translations. We don't translate just based on a translation we're already familiar with, although we should let that inform us and maybe guard us from some of the errors we could commit in translation. But we want to understand the word usage in the Greek text. We want to understand the grammar. And then in light of that, make a good translation. So I wish you the best as you translate the other verses, beginning in verse 19. I think we're going to go through verse 24. And I hope this gives you a good start.